My stepmother threw my grandmother's ring across the kitchen floor and told me to pick it up if I wanted it so badly. That was the morning I realized the house I grew up in had never actually been mine. My name is Avery, and I spent 31 years believing that loyalty to family was the same thing as love. It took a forged signature, a locked safe, and one sentence from an estate attorney to show me the difference. My grandmother passed in late October. She was 83, sharp until the end, the kind of woman who kept her own tax records and remembered everyone's birthday without a calendar. She raised me after my mom left when I was 4. Not officially, not with paperwork, just in every way that counted. She drove me to school, made me do homework at the kitchen table, taught me to parallel park in an empty church lot on Sunday afternoons. When my father remarried, I was 7. My stepmother moved into the house with her daughter, who was 6. And from that day forward, my grandmother watched everything shift around me like sand filling in behind a receding wave, quiet and total and irreversible. My stepsister's name is Portia. She is 6 months younger than me and has spent her entire life being handed things. I want to be fair. She wasn't cruel the way kids in movies are cruel. She didn't trip me in hallways or write things on bathroom walls. She was something more effective. She was simply preferred. Openly, consistently, without apology. My father didn't see it because he didn't want to. My stepmother certainly saw it and considered it her right. My grandmother saw it. She never said much, but she saw it. When she died, I flew home from Portland, where I'd been living for 4 years. I had a job I liked, a studio apartment with good light, a therapist I'd been seeing for 2 years who had helped me understand that the particular loneliness I carried was not a personal failing, but a reasonable response to having been raised on the outskirts of my own family. I packed a bag for a week. I thought I'd be back in Portland by the following Sunday. I was not back in Portland by the following Sunday. The funeral was on a Wednesday. My father stood at the front of the room looking smaller than I remembered. My stepmother stood next to him in a black dress she clearly bought for the occasion. Portia sat in the front row and cried beautifully. I sat in the second row and didn't cry at all. Not because I wasn't grieving, but because grief and I have always had a private arrangement. After the service, people came to the house, my grandmother's house, the one she had owned outright since 1987. The one with the yellow kitchen and the creaky third step and the window seat in the back bedroom where I used to read with a flashlight under a blanket when I was supposed to be asleep. My stepmother moved through the rooms like she was already redecorating. I noticed but said nothing. I was still in that early numb phase of loss where everything feels slightly slowed down, like watching a film with the frame rate dropped just enough to be wrong without being obvious. The attorney's office called 3 days later. A woman named Celeste introduced herself as the executor of my grandmother's estate and said she would like to meet with the family at her office on Friday. Her voice was pleasant and professional and gave nothing away. My father said he'd handle it. I assumed that meant he would go, get the information, and share it with me later. On Friday morning, I asked what time we were leaving. My stepmother looked up from her coffee. She has a way of looking at you that isn't quite eye contact, just slightly off. Like she's reading something on your forehead. She said the meeting was a family matter and that my father would take care of everything. I told her I was family. She said, "Of course you are," and looked back at her coffee. Something locked inside my chest. I knew that tone. I'd known it since I was 7 years old. It was the tone that meant she had already decided the shape of something and was simply waiting for me to accept it. I drove myself to the attorney's office. Celeste's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown. The kind of space that smells like paper and careful decisions. My father and stepmother were already seated when I walked in. Portia wasn't there. That detail registered somewhere in the back of my mind. Quiet, like a smoke alarm going off 2 floors below you. My stepmother's face did something complicated when she saw me. My father stood and hugged me, and it was the hug of a man who did not know he was about to be found out for something, which told me something important. Celeste began with the formalities. The house, the accounts, the personal property. My grandmother had been deliberate and organized, which surprised no one who knew her. Then Celeste looked at me and said, "There is a bequest made specifically to you." I had expected something. A piece of jewelry, maybe. The ring that had been my great-grandmother's. I had hoped for the ring. What Celeste described was not jewelry. My grandmother had left me 40% of the total estate, including the house. My stepmother made a sound that wasn't quite a word. My father said, "I'm sorry," in a voice that didn't sound sorry. Celeste continued, even and composed. The remaining 60% was divided among my father and a charitable trust my grandmother had named. Nothing had been left to my stepmother. Nothing had been left to Portia. The room got very quiet. Then my stepmother said my grandmother had clearly not been in her right mind at the end. My father said perhaps there had been undue influence. He didn't look at me when he said it. Celeste said, carefully, that the will had been drafted 14 months ago, witnessed by 2 independent parties and reviewed by a separate attorney who had confirmed my grandmother's competency at the time of signing. My stepmother's jaw moved. She was doing the math. I wasn't doing any math. I was sitting very still, thinking about the window seat in the back bedroom and a woman who saw me clearly for 31 years and put it in writing before she left. On the drive back to the house, I kept both hands on the wheel and didn't turn on the radio. They were waiting for me in the kitchen when I arrived. My stepmother stood at the counter with her arms crossed. My father sat at the table looking like a man who had been told to look disappointed and was doing his best. She said it first because she always goes first. She said my grandmother had been sentimental and confused, that the house belonged to this family, that I had gone off to Portland and built my life, and it wasn't right to take something from people who had been here, who had maintained things, who had given everything. I asked what she had given. She told me I was being selfish and cruel. My father said he hoped we could work this out as a family. I said I needed some air and walked out the back door. I sat on the porch steps for about 20 minutes. The neighborhood was quiet. Same oak tree in the yard my grandmother planted the year she moved in. Same fence with the missing slat my father had promised to fix for at least a decade. Same everything. I called my friend Juniper from the steps. She'd known me since college and had heard every version of this family over 9 years. She picked up on the second ring. I told her what happened. She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Are you safe right now?" I said yes. She said, "Then don't sign anything." That was the whole conversation I needed. Back inside, my stepmother had moved from the counter to the kitchen table. She had papers in front of her. Not official papers, handwritten on a legal pad. Calculations, it looked like. Numbers. She wanted to talk about fairness, she said. She wanted to talk about everything they had contributed over the years. The maintenance, the holidays, the visits to the hospital at the end. I did not say that most of those hospital visits were mine. I did not say that I had flown home 4 times in the past 18 months, that I had sat with my grandmother through 2 procedures, that I had been the one on the phone with her doctors while my stepmother sent flowers with a card signed from the whole family. I sat down and let her talk. She got to her point eventually. She wanted me to sign over my share of the house. Not everything, she was quick to say, just the house. I could keep the money from the accounts. She said it like she was being generous. I asked what she planned to do with the house. She said that wasn't really the point. I said I thought it was exactly the point. My father cleared his throat. He said he understood why I might feel entitled to my share, but that the house had been a family home and it didn't feel right to see it go to one person. I reminded him that it had already been left to one person, by the woman who owned it. My stepmother stood up then, walked to the kitchen window and said something about my grandmother being manipulated in her final months. Said I had spent those visits filling her head with things. Said that the woman she knew would never have left the house to someone who had abandoned the family. That word. Abandoned. I left Portland at 27 because I needed to exist somewhere I hadn't been defined by them. That wasn't abandonment. That was survival. But explaining that would have required them to believe something about what it felt like to grow up in this house as the one who didn't quite belong, and they had never been interested in that version of things. My stepmother opened the kitchen drawer and took out an envelope. Inside was a document, printed, not handwritten. It had my name on it and legal language I recognized from the meeting with Celeste, but the format was wrong, the header was wrong, and when I looked at the signature line at the bottom, I saw something that made the room go flat and bright the way rooms do when something important happens. My signature was already on it, not a forgery that looked wrong, a careful one, practiced. She said, I just need you to date it." I looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. There was something in her expression I hadn't seen before. Not guilt. More like impatience. Like she'd been waiting for this moment for a long time and was annoyed it was taking this long to finish. I said, "Where did you get my signature?" She said the form was from the attorney's office, that Celeste had sent it for my convenience, so I wouldn't need to come back in. I took a photo of the document with my phone. She reached for it. I stepped back. I said I would need to verify it with Celeste directly. My stepmother said there was no need for that. I said I disagreed. My father said very quietly that he thought I should trust the family. I put the document back on the table, kept the photo on my phone, walked upstairs to the room I had stayed in since arriving, and called Celeste. She answered on the third ring. I described the document. I sent her the photo. There was a pause on her end, the kind that means someone is choosing their words with a precision that tells you the words matter. She said she had not sent any document to anyone for my convenience. She said the signature on that form was not obtained through her office. She said I should not date, initial, or return that document under any circumstances. She also said, and this is the part that made me sit down on the edge of the bed, that my stepmother had contacted her office 3 weeks before my grandmother passed, asking about the will. 3 weeks before. She had known what was coming. She had been preparing. Celeste said she would document our conversation and recommended I photograph everything in the house that had been designated as personal property under the will before I left. I thanked her and hung up. I sat on the bed for a few minutes looking at the wall. There was a watercolor print there that my grandmother had bought at a craft fair when I was 9. She'd let me pick it. I'd chosen it because it had a lighthouse in it, and I had, at 9, been deeply invested in lighthouses for reasons I can't now remember. She kept it on that wall for 22 years. I wasn't going to cry. I was past the part of this where crying helped, but I sat there and felt the full weight of what had just happened. Not the forgery, though that was serious, the timeline. 3 weeks before she passed, while my grandmother was still alive, they were already figuring out how to undo what she had decided. That's a different kind of betrayal than anger. That's calculation. I photographed every room. I started with the back bedroom, the window seat, the watercolor, the quilt my grandmother had made in the 1990s, the box of letters she kept in the closet, my name written on the outside in her handwriting, the small jewelry box on her dresser. The ring was inside. I photographed it but did not take it yet. Not until things were documented correctly. I moved through the house methodically. Living room, dining room, kitchen. There were things missing. A silver candlestick that I remembered from every Christmas dinner. A framed photograph that had been on the hallway wall as long as I could remember. My grandmother at 30-something, standing in front of this house the year she bought it. The photograph had been replaced with a generic print from a chain store. I opened the hallway closet. It had been cleared. Items that had been there 2 days ago, my grandmother's winter coats, a box of her cookbooks, the basket she kept her knitting in, were gone. I went back downstairs. My stepmother was in the kitchen. She said nothing when I walked in. I said, "Where are the things from the closet?" She said she had donated them. To the church. She said it so flatly that I understood it was not an explanation, it was a wall. I called Celeste back from the kitchen with my stepmother standing right there. I told Celeste that personal property listed in the estate had been removed from the premises. Celeste said she would be sending a formal notice by end of day and that any further movement of estate property could have legal consequences. My stepmother's expression didn't change. But her hands did. They went from flat on the counter to gripping the edge. My father came into the kitchen then. He looked at me and looked at his wife and seemed to understand something had shifted, though I don't think he understood what or how far. He said, "Can we please handle this like adults?" I said, "I am." I left the kitchen and went back upstairs. I spent the next 2 hours drafting an email to Celeste, listing every item I could document that had been in the house before and was no longer there. I attached the photos. I attached the photo of the forged document. I wrote it clearly and without emotion, because the emotion was there, but it was mine, and I wasn't going to pour it into a legal document. At the end, I added one line that wasn't required. She planned this before my grandmother was gone. That changes what this is. I sent it. Then I sat on the floor with my back against the bed and let myself feel it for a few minutes. Not perform it, just feel it. The particular grief of realizing someone had been calculating the whole time you were grieving. The specific loneliness of being in the house where you were raised and knowing you were still, even now, an obstacle in someone else's plan. Juniper texted, "Any updates?" I typed back, "Yes." This got bigger. Her reply came fast. "Want me to drive down?" I thought about it. Then I typed, "Not yet. I need to finish something first." By the next morning, Celeste had forwarded my email to the estate's legal team with a preliminary assessment, possible fraud, possible removal of estate assets, both potentially actionable. She called me at 9 to walk me through the next steps, her voice carrying that same careful steadiness as before, the voice of someone who does this work because accuracy matters. I went downstairs for coffee. My father was at the kitchen table with his hands around a mug, not drinking, just holding it. He looked up when I came in. He said he wanted to talk. I poured my coffee and sat across from him. He started with the house. Said he knew it wasn't handled well. Said he understood I was upset. Said he hoped I could find it in myself to see their perspective, that they had been here, that they had sacrificed, that starting over at their age was hard. I listened. Then I asked him one question. I asked if he had known about the document. He looked at the table. I said his name. He looked up. I asked again. He said he'd known she was going to ask me. He didn't know about the signature. He said that last part quietly, and I believed him, which made it worse in a specific way, because not knowing about the signature didn't mean he hadn't known the rest. Didn't mean he hadn't sat in that chair while she planned it, hadn't stayed quiet because staying quiet was what he'd always done when she pushed things further than was right. I finished my coffee and stood up. He said, "What are you going to do?" I said, "What my grandmother trusted me to do." Celeste met with me that afternoon at her office. She had the forged document flagged by a handwriting analyst by end of day. Preliminary report suggesting the signature was traced or lifted from another source, likely the intake form I'd signed at my grandmother's hospital admission, which my stepmother had been present for. She'd lifted it from a hospital form while my grandmother was dying. I didn't react the way I might have. I didn't cry, didn't yell. I just sat there and let the fact of it settle into the category of things that are true that you cannot unfeel once you know. I asked Celeste what the options were. She walked me through them. By 4 in the afternoon, formal complaints had been filed with the county clerk's office and the State Bar's Estate Oversight Board. A restraining order on the property was in place, meaning nothing else could be removed or transferred without court approval. The attorney's office had sent certified letters to both my father and stepmother's address. When I pulled into the driveway that evening, my stepmother was standing on the porch. She had a different expression now. Not calculation. Something closer to the surface. She said I was tearing the family apart. I said the family had done that. She said my grandmother would have been ashamed of me. I looked at her for a moment. I thought about my grandmother at the craft fair. I thought about the window seat and the flashlight and the woman who sat across from an attorney 14 months ago and made sure, in writing, that I would have something to stand on. I said, "She left me 40% of everything. I think she'd be fine." I went inside. It took 6 weeks. That's how long it takes, apparently, for the legal process to get to a point where the outcome is no longer in question. During that time, I stayed mostly in Portland and drove back when Celeste needed me. Juniper came down one weekend and we went through the house together, documented everything, made lists. She didn't say a lot. That's why I've trusted her for 9 years. The handwriting report came back confirmed. The signature was fraudulent. My stepmother's attorney tried twice to argue it was a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, that she had believed she was submitting paperwork that had already been authorized. The second time her attorney made that argument, Celeste's team submitted the hospital intake form alongside the forged document, side by side. The comparison was not subtle. My father called me the week before the final hearing. He said he was sorry. He said he didn't know it had gone that far. He said he had always loved me. I thought about what to say for a long time. I told him I knew he loved me in whatever way he was capable of, and that I had spent a long time hoping that would be enough, and that I now understood it wasn't, and that this wasn't his fault entirely, but it also wasn't something I could keep absorbing. He was quiet. I said I needed time. He said he understood. I didn't know if he did. But I'd said what was true, and that was mine. The house is mine now, 40% by inheritance, the remaining interest purchased at assessed value through a process Celeste called clean and unremarkable in a tone that suggested most of these things are not. I haven't decided yet what to do with it. Some mornings I think I'll move back. Some mornings I think I'll rent it to a family who needs a good neighborhood and a yard with an oak tree. Some mornings I just think about the window seat and leave the question open. The ring was returned to me as part of the personal property settlement. I wear it on my right hand. It fits. A few months after everything resolved, I got a message through an online group for adult children of blended families. Short message, no greeting. Just a paragraph from someone who said she'd heard about my case through a mutual connection, that she was dealing with something similar, that she hadn't known she had the right to push back, that reading about what I'd done had made her think maybe she did. She was 23. She signed it with just her first initial. I wrote back that same evening. I told her that the right to push back doesn't come from winning. It comes from having something true on your side, and that the work is in finding it and not letting anyone convince you it doesn't exist. I told her to get an attorney. I told her to document everything. And then I told her what my grandmother had known for 31 years and written down so I couldn't be argued out of it. That what belongs to you doesn't stop belonging to you just because someone else decides they want it more. She replied 3 days later. 2 words, I will. I saved that message in a folder I labeled something that isn't evidence. Just the beginning of something I don't have a name for yet. But it's there. And so am I. I used to think the hardest part of what happened was the forgery. Someone tracing your signature off a hospital intake form, your name lifted from a piece of paper you signed while your grandmother was dying in the next room. That feels like a specific kind of violation that doesn't have a clean word for it. But the longer I sit with everything, the more I understand that the forgery wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the years before it. The forgery was just the moment they stopped pretending. There's something that happens when you grow up as the one who doesn't quite fit. You learn to read rooms. You learn to move carefully, to take up exactly the space you're allowed and not an inch more. You get very good at sensing when you're being tolerated versus when you're being included, even if you can't always name the difference as a child. I couldn't name it, but I felt it every day in that house. Every birthday where the celebration was slightly smaller, every holiday photo where I was slightly off to the side. I thought for a long time that the feeling was my fault, that if I just tried harder, was quieter, needed less, the gap would close. What I know now is that no amount of smallness would have been enough, because the problem was never my behavior. It was their plan. My stepmother didn't start calculating the week my grandmother got sick. She'd been calculating for years. What my grandmother understood and what she put into writing before she left was that calculation doesn't survive documentation. She sat across from an attorney, clear-eyed and deliberate, and made sure that what belonged to me couldn't be argued away. She couldn't protect me from everything they'd do after she was gone, but she gave me something to stand on. That's the kind of love that doesn't announce itself. It just holds. Celeste did her job. Juniper showed up when it counted. And my father. I think he loved me in the only way he knew how, which was quietly and incompletely and in ways that cost him nothing. I'm not angry at him the way I used to be. Anger like that takes energy I'd rather spend elsewhere. What I feel now is something closer to clarity. I see him accurately, and I've stopped hoping the picture will change. What I've learned, and I mean really learned in the way that changes how you move through the world, is that integrity has a paper trail. The truth doesn't ask you to believe it. It asks you to document it and then hold still while it does its work. My stepmother counted on me being too grieving, too tired, too emotionally undone to look carefully at what she put in front of me. She'd probably counted on that my whole life. The mistake she made was not understanding that my grandmother had spent 31 years teaching me to look carefully at things. You cannot take what someone has built by outlasting their grief. You can try. People do try. But the thing about choosing to be the kind of person who tells the truth, who documents, who calls the attorney on a Saturday, who doesn't sign something just because someone says to, that person, is harder to bury than they expected. I keep the ring on my right hand. I know what it cost her to make sure I'd have it.